Welcome to Untangling Traditions. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Suzanne Newcombe of the AyurYog Project, Entangled Histories of Yoga, Ayurveda and Alchemy in South Asia. Dr. Newcombe is lecturer in religious studies at Open University and a research fellow at INFORM, a charity based at King's College London. She researches yoga and Indian medicine, Ayurveda, from a sociological and social historical perspective. So welcome, Suzanne. Today, I'd like to discuss with you your most recent area of research, the institutionalization of yoga as medicine in modern India. So what does institutionalization of yoga as medicine actually mean?
That's a really good question. On the one hand, probably a lot of medicine has always been developed in institutions. Some of the earliest records we have of systematic treatments is in Buddhist monasteries in India. But more specifically, I'm a historian of the modern period and looking into history and sociology of the modern period. So I'm interested in, to put it simply, the formulation of Ayush as an independent ministry now, but before that it was under the Department of Health. And it is ingrained in Indian national policy as something that can promote the health and well-being of their population and also the global population. And so my recent research questions have been about how did that happen? And in comparison to, say, a lot of westernized nations, there's a lot of different approaches to what is state-sponsored medicine, but Ayush is a marked contrast to a lot of Western nations, although perhaps not so different from, say, China, which was also used as a model by the Indian government as to how to provide health for such a huge population, much of it very poor.
So I'm wondering, when did it actually begin in India and what factors brought it about?
A lot of what I'm studying is about the way that Indians reacted to colonialization and medicine, in fact, and the medicine that the colonizers brought with them. So the story of the contemporary way that yoga and Ayurveda have become organizations that are represented in universities, that have their own institutions, that issue certificates for people who are certified to practice, who are not certified to practice. A lot of this was done directly in response to the British systems of certifying medical physicians, which are some of the most tightly regulated qualifications, and who can say they're a qualified medical practitioner under those qualifications in India was also very tightly regulated. And so a lot of this happens in the 19th century when there started to be institutions primarily for the people who are working for the British Empire, and then expanding to the civil servants and allowing Indians to train and trying to, on the one hand, instill what they thought were the high standards of scientific expertise in India, and on the other hand, also to kind of ensure that the ways of doing things that were considered systematic and of the highest standards were imposed upon the Indian population in a kind of British way. However, that institutionalization, particularly in the 19th, and even today, is very partial, and it's always been a lot more complex situation on the ground. So it's very easy to tell a story of colonial oppression, but what I'm actually interested in is the mess of what was going on all the time and what is still going on now, which is really amazingly diverse and hard to tell a simple story about, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I could imagine that you've got sort of lineages as well, like family lineages that would be passing on knowledge and would sort of claim some type of authority over medicine, and then how does one turn that into a social system in which it covers all of India. It's quite a challenge, I would say.
Absolutely. And a lot of what is actually done is local practices. They're not even national practices. So more local understandings in a particular linguistic area, but also just even a particular geographical area will have their own remedies to do with the herbs of that location and what's been passed down in terms of specific traditions. And it's been very hard for me to access this. So unfortunately, a lot of what my research has been based on, well, fortunately, because they're very rich sources, has been the government surveyed reports that were trying to get a handle on what is Ayurveda, what is Unani, what is Siddha medicine, in particular in the Usman report in 1923. And also another incredibly rich source of information about medical practices in mid-20th century is the Chopra report, which was 1948. And both of those really show how, in surprising ways, how yoga and Ayurveda were related or not, but also what a huge diversity of approaches to health and healing are taken, and their family resemblances. But it really is a very diverse field.
Is this institutionalization in India responsible for the emphasis on therapy that we see in globalized forms of modern yoga?
This is an interesting question. And I think it's not so much the institutionalization, but just the global dominance of Western biomedicine that has framed a lot of how the whole globe thinks about what is therapeutic, what is not, what is okay to practice, what is beneficial for our bodies, and how do you measure that? How do you quantify it? How do you ensure that it's safe? However, on the one hand, there's it's a long, complex interrelationship which we've been exploring throughout the whole project in different capacities between bodily practices and health and different aims. So that's going to be touched on in every single interview in this series. But in the modern period in particular, I think what's important in the framing in terms of biomedicine is there's often a kind of a gold standard of this double-blind placebo test or specific quantifiable, measurable standards. And so there's a long history of Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia being harvested for specific active ingredients by Western biomedical practitioners. And this actually starts in the 19th century. And a lot of the first interest in Ayurveda are these series of reports on how are what are the local drugs and how can we use them in a biomedical framework. But there's a really important sense of the way a lot of medicine, traditional medicine work, alternative and complementary medicine work, which is more systemic and also multimodal. And so a particular intervention will have a number of suggestions, and it will be personalized for the context, for the environment, for the interpersonal relationship even. And so there's a set of principles that are worked with, but exactly what happens can't be quantified and replicated and rubber stamped in the same way you can tell an active ingredient for a drug. So the story of the 20th century is really as a story of how yoga and Ayurveda have, on the one hand, tried to fit this mold that was designed for other practices and other times, and on the other hand, have retained their identity and diversity, internal diversity of the practices, as well as, to some extent, there's tried to fight back against that model of definitions of quality and efficacy from a very strictly biomedical point of view.
Has there been attempts in the past to assess the efficacy of yoga as medicine in India?
Well, the first interest in yoga by the medical profession was actually in relation to cities and to what extent you might be able to use self-hypnosis, say, for surgery, particularly before there were reliable opiates and ways of sedating people for pain relief during medical procedures. And so that was kind of the first biomedical interests. And there's some really interesting overlaps between these ideas of yogic powers and mesmerism, which Carl Bayer's work is exploring. And there's a real rich exchange between European ideas and Indian ideas from hundreds of years. So untangling these traditions is a much bigger project than we've been actually able to do in AyurYog, which is quite exciting, really. And we hope that people will take that up. I mean, the classic example is what Joseph Alter talks about of Swami Kuvalyananda, who in the 1920s was a real pioneer in this biomedical dialogue. And he was based just outside of Mumbai and had lots of international connections. And his journal, which started publishing in the 1920s, had an international reach and was serialized in America. And so a lot of biomedical interest in the 20th century really comes from his experiments. And a lot of those were about breathing capacity and trying to see what biomedical measures, so say heartbeats, blood pressure, what kind of effects do yogic practices have on these? And by implication, by changing those measures, how could these affect someone's health in a positive way? And that kind of research has only increased in pace throughout the 20th century, and now is funded quite well by at least parts of it are funded quite well by Indian governments, by lots of institutions of graduate and postgraduate study of yoga and Ayurveda within India, as well as in America and growingly in Europe and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
Yes, very interesting. So that's the Yoga Mimamsa publication you're referring to, which is
Yes.
quite and covers many decades. And thankfully, they've made that available digitally, so you can access all of the past research studies. So, from your perspective, from your research now, what future role do you think yoga plays in the field of medicine, like both in India and then more globally?
Well, there's a lot of initiatives to institutionalize yoga in all sorts of health services that are often based on these biomedical models. But what I find most fascinating is the pluralism of human approaches to health and well-being. And we often think there's a kind of tension about approving of complementary alternative medicine. Even the title expresses the dominance of biomedicine, but when you actually look at what people are doing in to use the horrible dichotomy, but like Western context, where you've got quite a lot of disposable income and choice, a lot of consumers are really pluralistic in their health choices, and they're doing a lot of things to improve their health and well-being outside of the context of the biomedical profession. And you've got the Indian context, which is also this really rich pluralistic environment, but often people are much more limited in what choices they can access because of it being more difficult to travel, and a lot of people are much poorer. So there might only be a few practitioners within both the geographical and financial reach of someone. But both contexts are incredibly plural, and I think there's just something about how humans want to be healthy that requires a multifaceted approach. It's about the habits of your lifestyle. It's about what contributes to your ongoing health and happiness, as well as what might affect a particular symptom that you have at a particular time. So it's kind of a long-winded way of saying what I find really fascinating is the rich complexity of the multimodal interventions that yoga offers. And I would like to see how this is really different than a biomedical gold standard of this intervention affects this X, Y, and Z conditions in a certain way. I don't think you can apply that. But on the other hand, I think we can get much more subtle in our understanding of how normal it is to approach a variety of interventions, and the really subtle and complex and qualitative ways that they affect our lives, and that's really valid and important. There's a medical anthropologist at Edinburgh, Stephen X, who has done some really interesting work in Calcutta, but he was also looking at a naturopathy clinic in a deprived area of Scotland. And I think that what this kind of medical intervention shows was when he was looking at this, a lot of people needed space to just reflect on what choices they're making in terms of what they're eating, how they're exercising, their kind of relationships. And I think that these interventions are what people get in yoga and Ayurvedic consultations, as well as specific aspects of those traditions. But a lot of the complexity of what makes humans happy and healthy is about these really complex contexts, which are, you can't say yoga is this or is that, but it has certain tools that it can address in relationship and in a particular time and place, which can be studied, but they can't be studied in the same way that you can study an active ingredient in a pill.
There's issues around, I guess, the migration of a tradition, like a very diverse tradition like yoga, moving from a context such as a religious context into a health context. But then also I had a question about like the dietary recommendations or herbal recommendations from Ayurveda moving into a different cultural space where perhaps the diet doesn't relate, or the food is not so accessible, or perhaps even understood how to prepare in a different cultural context. Do you find that affects the way medicines or the therapies are applied?
It's a really fascinating area to watch in terms of the 21st century. But I think that it's important to understand Ayurveda as a very diverse tradition, which always had local adaptations. And there's a lot of discussion amongst Sanskritists about what does this herb mean in this context. And there's kind of a family of plants which might be appropriate depending on where you are, or if you can get them from a higher altitude, the active properties might be more potent. So there's always been this kind of adaptation. And I think that one of the really wonderful things I've learned in our kind of exploration of practice, and some of what Dagmar's exchange with Andrew Mason brings out, is the way that medical preparations are a lot like a good cook. And there's this sense of taste and a sense of feel about what works right. And there's a way of combining different ingredients that either works or it doesn't. And then some people are really gifted at understanding what's going on here, and you can get better with experience. And there's a set of principles involved, and some things just don't work, and other things you might have never tried before, but you find do work. So what I find really fascinating are the ways in which the Ayurvedic principles are being adapted to the foods of our European cultures. And this is just really ongoing exploration, which both Indian practitioners who have traveled over here and Western people who are being trained are looking into. But there's nothing different about this than in the history of all these medical traditions. And it's an art and a science. And it's quite fun if it's being done interestingly and well.
Last question would be on this word of therapy in the Indian context. So is it as heavily regulated as it is in the sort of Western biomedical systems, where one can't call the techniques therapeutic as such?
Well, I think that people overestimate the extent of regulation in both contexts, in fact. And there are organizations, both promoted by the Indian government and in, like say, Western yoga therapy associations, Ayurvedic practitioner associations, which try to provide a certification of a level of education and a kind of ethical framework. And in general, these are really helpful things to have. But on the other hand, there's actually nothing to stop almost anyone calling themselves a yoga therapist or even an Ayurvedic practitioner with no training. In that, the Ayurvedic title is more closely regulated in India than it is outside of India. But so this creates a quite interesting ambiguity, really, between how do you present yourself, and a lot of it is actually about how you present claims of cure for specific illnesses, and that's often more tightly regulated by advertising standards, in fact, than anything else. And so a lot of people who are offering all sorts of alternatives, some of them quite dangerous, to specific illnesses like COVID-19, like cancer, would be in breach of a kind of advertising standard. In regards to how the Indian government's called for more traditional treatments into our current crisis of COVID-19, I think there's a really interesting contrast between what can we do to support our health and well-being and our immunity and to stay healthy, and what specific active ingredients might attack this particular virus. And I think that's what the traditions of both yoga and Ayurveda have a lot to offer, are ways about keeping healthy, keeping our immune system strong, and how to live better, and that these shouldn't be underestimated as really important tools in helping the global population return to some sense of normalcy. But it's also not the same thing as direct drugs which might attack the virus.
Indeed. So that's a great place to finish. So thank you very much, Suzanne, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you very much.